Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The moon was a sliver of bone in a bruised sky, offering little light and even less hope to the plague-stricken hovels of the outer district. Smoke from overwhelmed pyres clung to the air, a bitter perfume that failed to mask the scent of sickness and despair. Alina pulled her woolen cloak tighter, the coarse fabric a poor shield against the creeping cold that had little to do with the night and everything to do with fear. 7 years had passed since the king had cast her out, and she had learned to live in the shadows, a ghost defined by the silence of her wolf and the hollowness in her chest where a bond should have been. Yet here, in the darkness, where no one knew her name, a different power stirred in her hands, a warmth that defied the king's decree and the gods' seeming indifference. She knew the whispers followed her, tales of a veiled healer, a miracle worker. But she also knew that miracles in King Lucen's kingdom were often mistaken for treason, and treason was always met with a blade. Inside the cramped one-room dwelling, the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood fever. A young boy, no older than 5, lay gasping on a straw pallet. His mother knelt beside him, her face a mask of grief, her knuckles white as she wrung a damp cloth. She looked up as Alina entered, her eyes wide with a desperate, fragile hope that twisted Alina's heart. "The healer," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. They said you could help." Alina gave a slow nod, keeping the heavy cowl of her cloak low over her face. Her identity was her only protection. She knelt opposite the mother, the worn floorboards groaning under her weight. The boy's skin was slick with sweat, his breathing a ragged, rattling sound that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. His scent was sharp with sickness, but underneath it, Alina could still smell the sweet, milky innocence of a child. It was a scent that a true Omega, a pack mother, would have cherished. For Alina, it was just another reminder of what she was not. She reached out, her gloved fingers hesitating for a moment before gently brushing the matted hair from the boy's forehead. A wave of heat radiated from him, so intense it felt like standing before a blacksmith's forge. "Please," the mother begged, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "He is all I have." Alina's own throat tightened. She had nothing, and no one. Perhaps that was why she did this. Perhaps, by saving the pieces of other people's lives, she could distract herself from the shattered fragments of her own. She slipped the rough leather gloves from her hands, tucking them into the folds of her cloak. The night air was cold on her bare skin, but a familiar warmth was already beginning to gather in her palms. She laid one hand on the boy's chest, and the other on his forehead. At her touch, a soft, pearlescent light bloomed from her skin, casting the grim room in an ethereal glow. "The..." mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the part that was most dangerous. This was the magic that defied explanation, the power that branded her a saint to the desperate and a witch to the crown. Closing her eyes, Alina focused, pushing past the pain in her own chest, the phantom limb of a bond severed before it could ever truly form. She ignored the memory of King Lucen's face, his eyes the color of a winter storm, his voice a blade of ice as he'd spoken the words that had broken her. "An Omega without a wolf, a mate who cannot shift. You are a flaw in the bloodline, a mistake. I reject you." The words still had the power to make her flinch, but she forced them down, pouring her energy, her very essence, into the child beneath her hands. She could feel the fever as if it were her own, a raging inferno in his blood. She could feel the plague, a living, venomous thing, coiling in his lungs. It was an ancient and vicious sickness, one the pack's most seasoned. Healers had failed to cure, but Alina's gift was different. It wasn't about herbs or poultices. It was life, raw and untamed, flowing through her. The light from her hands intensified, the silver-white energy sinking into the boy's skin. A low hum filled the room, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of one's bones. The boy's rattling breaths began to even out, the violent tremors in his small body starting to subside. The inferno of his fever banked, slowly receding under the cool tide of her power. It was a draining process. She felt her own life force being siphoned away, leaving a familiar, aching exhaustion in its wake. But she pushed on, envisioning the sickness as a dark, clinging tar, and her light as a cleansing solvent, dissolving it until nothing remained. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The hum faded, and the light from her hands receded, leaving them pale and trembling in the dim lantern light. The boy took a deep, clear breath, then another. His eyes fluttered open, no longer glazed with fever but clear and focused. He blinked slowly, looking from his mother's stunned face to the stranger kneeling over him. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice weak but free of the death rattle that had choked it moments before. The woman let out a sob, a raw, wrenching sound of pure, unadulterated relief. She threw her arms around her son, burying her face in his now cool hair. Alina watched them, a familiar ache blooming in her chest. This was her reward. This fleeting moment of witnessing a love so pure it was a physical force in the room. It was the closest she would ever get to the connection she was born for, but had been denied. She pulled her gloves back on, her movements slow and weary. As she rose to her feet, the mother looked up, her face shining with tears. How can I ever repay you?" She reached for a small, worn pouch at her belt. Alina held up a hand, shaking her head. "Your silence is the only payment I require," she said, her voice deliberately low and raspy, disguised from its natural tone. "Speak of this to no one. The King's Guard has little patience for things they do not understand." The warning hung in the air, a stark reminder of the world outside this small miracle. The mother nodded fervently, clutching her son tighter. "I will tell no one. I swear it on his life, which you have just given back to us." Alina gave a final curt nod and slipped back out into the night, pulling the heavy cloak around herself like a shroud. The cold bit at her, sharper now that her inner warmth was depleted. The streets were empty, a curfew having driven everyone indoors. Only the patrols of the King's Guard dared to walk the night, their heavy tread and the clink of their maya a constant menacing rhythm in the darkness. She kept to the alleyways, a wraith moving through a city of ghosts. From here, she could see the silhouette of the great castle, Ardar Keep, looming over the city like a stone predator. Its towers clawed at the sky, and a few windows glowed with cold, distant light. It was his castle, Lucens, the alpha of alphas, the king of the Northern Fang, the man who was her mate, and her greatest shame. Her wolf, the weak and silent creature that lived like a crippled thing inside her, stirred faintly at the sight of the keep. It was a pathetic tremor, a whisper of instinct that had never been strong enough to grant her a shift. It was the reason for her exile, the source of her unworthiness. Omegas were the heart of the pack, the nurturers, the bearers of the next generation of strong wolves. A wolfless Omega was a curse, a dead end in a bloodline. She finally reached the edge of the city, slipping through a little-known gap in the crumbling old wall that separated the outer districts from the tangled woods beyond. Her cottage was nestled deep within the forest, hidden by ancient pines and a thick blanket of ivy. It was small and unassuming, with a garden of medicinal herbs and a chimney that puffed a thin, constant stream of smoke. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth. Elspeth, the old woman who had taken her in 7 years ago, sat in her rocking chair, her fingers busy mending a worn blanket. She was a hedge witch of sorts, a woman who understood the old ways and had recognized the strange power in Alina long before it had fully manifested. Elspeth had been the one to teach her how to control it, how to shield herself, how to survive. She looked up as Alina entered, her wrinkled face etched with worry. "You were gone long," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The patrols are thicker tonight. I heard their hounds." Alina pulled back her cowl, the firelight catching the weariness in her eyes and the paleness of her cheeks. A boy, near the tanneries. The fever was strong in him. She sank onto a stool by the fire, stretching her trembling hands toward the flames. "He is well? He will live," Elspeth sighed, setting her mending aside. "You are a fool, child. A brave, compassionate fool, but a fool all the same. I cannot sit here and do nothing while they die, Elspeth. You do not just do something, Alina. You perform miracles, and the king is growing desperate. Desperate men do not reward miracles. They dissect them. They fear them." She leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "The whispers have reached the castle. I heard it from the baker's boy. They speak of a veiled saint who walks through the plague districts untouched. King Lucen has offered a bounty. 1,000 gold crowns for the one who brings this saint to him. A cold dread, far worse than the night's chill, seeped into Alina's bones. 1,000 crowns. It was a king's ransom, enough to make a son betray his father, or a neighbor to sell out a friend, enough to make someone careless, to follow the hooded figure who left a house where a child had miraculously recovered. He thinks this healer has a cure, Alina murmured, her mind racing. He thinks this healer has power, Elspeth corrected grimly. And King Lucen covets power above all else. Power he can understand, control, or destroy. You, my dear, fall into the last two categories. Alina stared into the fire, the flames dancing in her wide, dark eyes. She could feel a strange thrumming under her skin, a phantom echo along the severed mate bond. It happened sometimes, when his emotions were powerful enough to bleed across the chasm of his rejection rage. Usually, a cold, absolute fury that felt like ice water in her veins. He was angry tonight, royally, incandescently angry. Suddenly, the sharp, frantic barking of dogs shattered the quiet of the forest. Not the baying of hunting hounds, but the panicked sound of guard dogs. Elspeth's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "They're close," she breathed. The barking was cut off abruptly with a series of sickening yelps. Silence descended again, heavier and more menacing than before. Then came a new sound, the thunder of heavy war horses, their iron-shod hooves chewing up the soft earth of the forest floor, coming directly toward their cottage. It wasn't a patrol. It was a squadron. Alina scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked around the small room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The windows were too small. The back door led to an open clearing. They were trapped. The horses drew to a halt just outside. The jangle of bridles and the snorting of the massive beasts loud enough to be inside the room with them. Heavy boots hit the ground. A moment of tense silence, and then a single, authoritative knock pounded against their simple wooden door. The force of it shook the entire cottage. It was not a knock asking for entry. It was a knock that promised to break down whatever stood in its way. A voice cut through the night, deep and resonant with command. A voice she recognized with a jolt of pure terror. It wasn't the king, but it was the next worst thing. General Vorlag, the king's ruthless right hand, the executioner of his will. By order of King Lucen, the general's voice boomed, each word a hammer blow. "Open this door. We know the healer is within." The door didn't just open, it imploded. A heavy boot kicked it from its hinges, sending the slab of splintered wood flying into the cottage. It crashed against the far wall, knocking over a shelf of dried herbs and clay pots that shattered on the stone floor. Elspeth cried out, more in outrage than fear, as three figures filled the doorway, their broad shoulders blocking the faint moonlight. They were the king's royal guard, clad in black leather and steel plate, the snarling silver wolf of the Ardar line embossed on their breastplates. Leading them was General Vorlag. He was a mountain of a man, his face a roadmap of old scars, the most prominent of which was a pale, puckered line that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his iron-gray hairline. His eyes, small and hard as river stones, swept the room, dismissing Elspeth with a glance and landing on Alina. There was no flicker of recognition, only the cold assessment of a hunter who had cornered his prey. "The healer," he stated, his voice a gravelly rasp. It wasn't a question. "There is no healer here," Elspeth snapped, stepping between Alina and the general, her small, frail body a surprisingly defiant barrier. "Only an old woman and her ward. You have no right to burst into our home." Vorlag's lip curled in a semblance of a smile that held no warmth. "I have the king's right, and the king's rights are absolute." He gestured with a gauntleted hand, and two of his men moved past Elspeth, their armor clanking with each heavy step. One grabbed Alina's arm, his grip like a vice. The other began a swift, brutally efficient search of the small cottage, overturning the mattress, pulling books from shelves, and kicking aside the shattered pottery. "Let her go," Alina said, her voice quiet but firm, surprised at its steadiness. Panic was a cold serpent in her belly, but 7 years of living on the edge had taught her to wear a mask of calm. "I am the one you want." The soldier's grip tightened, and Vorlag took a step closer, his sheer size and presence dominating the small space. He loomed over her, his scent a mix of cold night air, oiled leather, and something else, the faint, metallic tang of shed blood that always clung to him. "We received a report," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her cowled face. a boy in the tanner's district, dying of the blood fever. His mother prayed for a miracle. He paused, letting the words hang in the tense air. It seems her prayers were answered. The boy is not only alive, he is well. Completely recovered. A phenomenon the king's own physicians have declared. Impossible, the other soldier grunted. Found nothing, General. No potions, no arcane symbols. Just herbs and books on horticulture. Vorlag's gaze remained fixed on Alina. The magic is not in your house, is it? It is in you. He reached out, and before she could react, he ripped the cowl from her head. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating her pale skin, wide, dark eyes, and the long, unbound fall of her raven-black hair. For a moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. The general's stony expression shifted, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had been hunting a mythical saint, a powerful sorceress. He had found a girl who looked too young, too fragile, to command such power. "What is your name?" he demanded. Alina's jaw tightened. She would not speak it. That name belonged to the ghost of a girl who had been publicly shamed and exiled. It was a name that would mean nothing to him now, but everything to the king. Her name is of no consequence, Elspeth interjected, her voice sharp with a protective fury. She has done no wrong. She has saved lives where your king's men have only dug graves. Vorlag ignored her. Take her, he commanded the soldier holding her arm. The king will have his answers. They dragged her toward the door. As she passed Elspeth, the old woman grabbed her free hand, her wrinkled fingers surprisingly strong. Be brave, little bird, she whispered, her eyes filled with a desperate fear that belied her defiant tone. Remember who you are, not what he called you. Then she was pulled away, out into the biting cold of the night. The squadron of guards waited, their horses stamping impatiently, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They forced her onto a horse behind one of the guards, binding her wrists in front of her with cold, heavy iron manacles. The metal was a shock against her skin, a stark symbol of her captured state. As they rode away, Alina looked back, at the small, warm light of her cottage, at the silhouette of Elspeth standing alone in the doorway. It was the only home she had known since her exile, and she knew with a sickening certainty that she would never see it again. The journey to Ardar Keep was a grim, silent procession. They moved through the dark woods and re-entered the city, her captors forming a tight, intimidating escort around her. Even with her cowl gone, no one would recognize her. She had been a child of 15 when she was presented at court, a ghost for 7 years since. Now, at 22, she was a stranger. As they passed from the sickness-ridden outer districts into the fortified inner city, the change was stark. The air here was cleaner, the cobblestone streets were swept, and torches burned brightly in iron sconces on the walls of stone houses. Here, the plague was a distant threat, something that happened to the poor and the unimportant. But fear had a way of seeping through even the highest walls. Curtains twitched in windows as they passed, and the few sentries they saw on the walls stared down at the procession with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They were not looking at a prisoner. They were looking at the veiled saint, the whispered-about miracle worker, now captured and bound for the king. Alina's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every clatter of the horse's hooves on the stone brought her closer to him, closer to the source of her deepest wound. The faint thrum along the broken bond, which had been a dull ache for years, was now a sharp, insistent pulse. It was as if a nerve, long thought dead, was suddenly screaming with life. Her silent wolf cowered in the depths of her soul, terrified of the proximity to the Alpha, who had so utterly rejected them. Ardar Keep rose before them, a black monolith against the star-dusted sky. It was not a place of beauty or elegance. It was a fortress built for war and survival, a perfect reflection of its master. The great iron portcullis was raised, and they rode into the courtyard, their arrival announced by the sharp calls of the gate guards. She was hauled unceremoniously from the horse, her legs weak and trembling. They did not take her to the grand halls or the audience chambers. They led her down into the bowels of the castle, through cold, damp corridors where the torchlight seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of mildew and old despair. They stopped before a heavy iron door, and with a screech of rusty hinges, she was thrown into a cell. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the profound silence. A heavy bolt was thrown, sealing her in. The cell was small, empty save for a thin layer of straw on the floor and a single, high, barred window that showed only a sliver of the dark sky. It was colder than the night outside. A deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Alina sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself. The iron of the manacles was freezing against her skin. She was in his castle, his dungeon, a prisoner awaiting his judgment. What would he do when he saw her? Would he even recognize her? 7 years was a long time. Perhaps he had forgotten her face entirely, remembering her only as a title, a concept, the flawed Omega, the mate who was a mistake. The thought brought a bitter sting to her eyes. She would not cry. She had shed all her tears for him on the night of her rejection, crying until her throat was raw and her heart felt like an empty, echoing cavern. She had no more tears to give him. Hours passed. The sliver of sky in the window slowly lightened from inky black to a deep, bruised purple, then to the bleak gray of dawn. The sounds of the castle began to filter down to her, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the faint shouts of the training yard, the low murmur of a life from which she was utterly removed. She drifted into a state of weary, numbness, her mind too tired to fear, her body too cold to feel. She thought of the boy she had healed, his mother's tear-streaked face. She thought of Elspeth, alone in their ruined cottage. Those thoughts were anchors in the swirling sea of her dread. She had done good. She had not hurt anyone. Whatever happened next, she would hold on to that. Finally, just as the first rays of morning sun cast a pale, dusty beam through the high window, she heard the sound of heavy boots approaching. The bolt was thrown back with a loud crack, and the door creaked open. 2 different guards stood there, their faces impassive. "The king will see you," one of them said, his voice devoid of any emotion. They pulled her to her feet and led her out of the cell, up winding stone staircases, through hallways that grew wider and cleaner the higher they went. Tapestries depicting great hunts and ancient battles hung on the walls, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the grim reality of the dungeon. Servants and courtiers flattened themselves against the walls as they passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Whispers followed her like a rustling cloak. "It's her, the saint." They stopped before a set of towering double doors carved from dark polished oak and bound with black iron. The guards on either side of the door stood ramrod straight, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. One of the guards escorting her knocked once, a sharp, formal rap. A voice from within, deep and familiar, called out, "Enter." It was Vorlag. Alina's breath hitched. The massive doors swung inward without a sound, revealing the throne room. It was a vast, cavernous hall, its ceiling lost in shadow. Tall, arched windows let in the cold morning light, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Banners of the Ardar house, a snarling silver wolf on a field of black, hung from the stone walls, their stillness adding to the room's oppressive silence. At the far end, upon a raised dais, sat a throne not of gold or silver, but of polished black obsidian, its sharp angles and cold, light-swallowing surface looking more like a weapon than a seat of power. And in front of it, standing with his back to them as he gazed out one of the tall windows, was the king. Even as a silhouette, he was an intimidating presence, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a kingdom. He was dressed not in regal finery, but in simple, practical black leather and wool, the attire of a warrior, not a courtly king. The guards shoved Alina forward, forcing her to walk the long expanse of polished stone floor alone. Her manacled hands were a dead weight in front of her. The sound of her soft-soled shoes was swallowed by the immense space. She stopped 10 paces from the dais and was forced to her knees. The cold of the stone seeped through her thin trousers. A final, humiliating touch. General Vorlag stepped forward from the shadows beside the throne. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice resonating in the hall. "We have brought the healer." The figure at the window did not move for a long, agonizing moment. The silence stretched, tight and suffocating. Alina kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could feel his power in the air, a palpable, suffocating pressure. The bond, so long dormant, was now a roaring fire in her chest, a screaming, desperate thing demanding recognition from its other half. Then, slowly, he turned. Alina forced herself to look up. 7 years had honed the sharp planes of his face into something harder, more severe. The dark hair she remembered was trimmed shorter, and a faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, almost a mirror of Vorlag's, a testament to a king who fought beside his men. But his eyes were the same, the color of a storm-tossed sea, cold and deep and utterly unreadable. They swept over her, taking in her disheveled state, the bound hands, the dirt on her cheek. There was no recognition in them. Not at first. He was looking at a prisoner, a curiosity, a potential tool or threat. Then his gaze sharpened. His eyes narrowed slightly, tracing the line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, the shape of her eyes. A flicker of something crossed his face, not memory, not yet, but a deep, primal confusion. It was the wolf within him, the beast that had chosen her so long ago, stirring in response to her presence, even if the man had forgotten. He took a step forward, descending from the dais. Each step was deliberate, silent, the movement of a predator. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to crane her neck to see his face. He smelled of pine, cold steel, and a unique, masculine scent that was so deeply familiar it made her ache. He stared down at her, his expression a mask of stone. The silence in the room was absolute. And then, he spoke. His voice was deeper than she remembered, a low rumble of stone grinding on stone, laced with an authority that could freeze blood. "So," he said, the single word dripping with a cold, ancient disdain as recognition finally dawned in his storm-gray eyes. "The miracle worker is the mistake I cast aside." The words fell into the cavernous silence of the throne room, each one a shard of ice-striking stone. The mistake I cast aside. Alina felt them not in her ears, but in her bones. A seismic shock that resonated with the old, deep wound of his rejection. The fragile composure she had clung to all morning fractured. For a heartbeat, she was 15 again, standing before this same man, her heart full of a desperate, fated love, only to have it torn from her chest and crushed under the heel of his ambition. She squeezed her eyes shut, the image of his younger face less scarred, but just as cold, searing the back of her eyelids. But then, Elspeth's last words whispered through. Her memory. "Remember who you are, not what he called you." She was not that broken girl anymore. She was a healer. She was a survivor. Her eyes snapped open, meeting his. She did not cower or weep. She held his storm-gray gaze, and for the first time in 7 years, she allowed him to see not the shame he had branded her with, but a flicker of defiance. A quiet strength forged in the shadows he had banished her to. Lucen saw it. He saw the change, and it seemed to unsettle him more than tears would have. The mask of cold disdain on his face tightened, his jaw clenching almost imperceptibly. The wolf inside him, the primal alpha that had chosen her against all logic, was clawing at the bars of the king's control. He could feel it, a low growl in the back of his mind, an instinct that screamed, "Mate, mine!" But the king, the man who had built his reign on the foundation of ruthless logic, silenced it. "So the wolfless Omega has learned parlor tricks," he said, his voice laced with a dangerous silkiness. He began to circle her, his steps slow and predatory, like a wolf assessing a cornered fox. "Tell me, Alina, where did you acquire this gift? Did you bargain with some back-alley sorcerer? Make a pact with one of the old gods we have long since forgotten?" Every word was designed to belittle her, to frame her power as something dark and transactional. He was trying to put her back in the box he had made for her, the flawed, unworthy thing. "There was no bargain," she said, her voice raspy from disuse and fear, but clear. "I do not know where it comes from. It simply is." He stopped in front of her again, his shadow falling over her kneeling form. "It simply is," he repeated, mocking her. "Men of medicine and science have studied this plague for months. My best healers can do nothing but offer comfort as my people die. Yet you, a girl I exiled for being an empty vessel, can walk through the slums and simply, what? Wish the sickness away." The phantom bond between them was a taut wire, vibrating with his suspicion and her pain. She could feel the crushing weight of his royal authority, an almost physical pressure meant to make her break. But beneath it, she could also feel a frantic, desperate curiosity. He needed to believe, and he was terrified of what that belief would cost him. "I do not wish it away," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I take the sickness into myself. I cleanse it. It is a transfer." It was the closest she had ever come to explaining it, even to herself. Lucen's eyes narrowed. "A transfer?" He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. The proximity was overwhelming. His scent, pine, steel, and the clean, cold smell of winter air filled her senses, making her dizzy. The urge to submit, the Omega's instinct to yield to the Alpha, was a powerful, sickening wave. She fought it, digging her nails into her palms, the faint pain a grounding sensation. "Show me," he commanded, his voice a low growl. I cannot summon it on command like a trained dog, a muscle feathered in his jaw. His control was fraying. You performed your miracle on a tanner's son. You will perform it for me. He stood abruptly, turning his back on her. Vorlag, bring him in. The general, who had been watching the exchange with a stony, baffled expression, nodded curtly and strode from the throne room. The silence that descended was heavier than before. It was just the two of them now, bound by a history of rejection and an impossible, undeniable connection. Alina remained on her knees, the cold of the floor a creeping numbness in her legs. Moments later, Vorlag returned, followed by 2 guards carrying a man on a stretcher. He was one of the royal guard, his uniform stained with sweat, his face pale and clammy. His breathing was a shallow, ragged affair, and a low moan escaped his lips. The unmistakable, cloying scent of the blood fever filled the grand hall, a vulgar intrusion in this place of power. They set the stretcher down on the cold stone floor between Alina and the throne. "Kaelin," Lucen said, his voice tight. "One of my best. He fell ill 2 nights ago. The physicians have given him until dusk." He turned his piercing gaze back to Alina. "Here is your chance to prove you are more than a charlatan. Heal him. Now." It was a command, an ultimatum. Her life, and the life of the man on the stretcher, hung on her next move. She looked from the suffering guard to the king's implacable face. She could feel the man's life force flickering, a guttering candle flame about to be extinguished. Her instincts, the very core of her being, screamed at her to help him. It had nothing to do with the king's command. It was who she was. Slowly, stiffly, she rose to her feet. The guards tensed, but Lucen held up a hand, stopping them. He watched her, his eyes missing nothing, cataloging every movement. She walked to the stretcher and knelt beside the dying man. His scent was thick with pain and fever. "The manacles," she said, her voice quiet but firm, holding up her bound wrists. "I cannot help him like this." Lucen hesitated for a fraction of a second. Vorlag looked to his king, awaiting the order. "Remove them," Lucen commanded. A guard stepped forward with a key and unlocked the heavy iron cuffs. They fell to the floor with a loud clang that echoed in the hall. Freedom from their weight was an instant relief. Alina rubbed her chafed wrists, and then, taking a deep breath, she placed her bare hands on the sick man's chest. She closed her eyes and focused, shutting out the imposing presence of the king, the watchful eyes of his general, everything but the dying man beneath her touch. She reached for the warmth inside her, the wellspring of life that was her gift and her curse. The pearlescent light bloomed from her palms, soft at first, then growing in intensity. It cast a silver-white glow on Kaelin's face, smoothing the lines of pain. A collective gasp came from the guards standing by the door. Vorlag took an involuntary step forward, his jaw slack with disbelief, but Alina was only aware of the torrent of sickness pouring into her. It was stronger this time, the plague more advanced. It felt like swallowing fire and ice, a searing, freezing poison that tried to overwhelm her. She felt her own energy draining away at an alarming rate, a dizzying emptiness spreading through her. A low hum filled the air, the sound of her power at work, a sound that seemed to make the very stones of the castle vibrate. Lucen watched, transfixed. He saw the impossible light, saw the sweat break out on Alina's brow, saw the faint tremor that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. He saw the dying flush recede from his soldier's skin, saw the ragged breathing deepen, and even out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He was not watching a parlor trick. He was witnessing a resurrection. And he was watching the woman he had called a flaw, an empty vessel, burn with a power that defied every law of nature he knew. The alpha wolf in him howled in triumph. See what you threw away? She is life. She is power. She is ours." The king in him saw a weapon, a cure, the key to saving his kingdom and securing his legacy. The man was lost, adrift in a sea of confusion, and a sudden, sharp, and terrifying surge of possessiveness. The light from Alina's hands faded. She swayed, her face as pale as bleached bone. Her strength was gone. She had poured too much of herself into the healing. Kaelin, the guard, took a deep, shuddering breath, and his eyes fluttered open. He looked around, confused but clear-eyed, the fever gone. Alina's own eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed. Before Vorlag or any of the guards could move, Lucen was there. In 2 long, silent strides, he crossed the space between them and caught her before she hit the floor. He swept her into his arms, her slight weight a shocking contrast to the immense power he had just witnessed, her head lolled against his chest, her raven hair spilling over his arm. Her skin was cold and clammy, her breathing shallow. For a terrifying moment, he thought she had traded her life for his guards. He held her closer, an instinct he couldn't control, and felt the faint, thready beat of her pulse against his own chest. He stood there in the center of his throne room, holding the mate he had rejected, the woman who had just performed an impossible act of creation before his very eyes. Her scent, a unique mix of rain-washed herbs and something indefinably hers, filled his senses, bypassing his mind and striking straight at the core of his being. The severed bond between them flared, not as a dull ache, but as a searing, white-hot agony of connection that had been denied for too long. Vorlag stared, speechless. "Your Majesty?" Lucen looked down at the pale, unconscious face in his arms. He saw the smudges of dirt on her cheek, the faint blue veins beneath the translucent skin of her eyelids, the utter vulnerability of her in that moment, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his very soul, that he could never let her go. She was the answer to the plague. She was a power beyond his understanding. She was his. He looked up, his storm-gray eyes locking with his general's. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a king giving an order, but the low, possessive growl of an alpha claiming his territory. "Prepare the queen's chambers," he commanded. "She will be moved there at once." He looked back down at Alina, his hand tightening its grip almost painfully. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear as he whispered words meant only for her, conscious or not. "You are mine now, little healer. Your miracles belong to the crown. They belong to me." He shifted his grip, his thumb stroking, across the bare, sensitive skin of her throat, right over the place where a mating mark should have been. The touch was a brand, a promise, and a cage all in one. Alina woke to the unfamiliar sensation of softness. For a moment, suspended in the hazy space between sleep and awareness, she thought she was back in her own bed in the cottage, wrapped in the lumpy wool blankets Elspeth had patched a dozen times over. But the scent was wrong. Instead of wood smoke, dried herbs, and damp earth, the air was clean and carried the faint, expensive perfume of beeswax and dried lavender. The fabric beneath her cheek was not coarse wool but impossibly smooth silk, cool against her skin. A heavy weight lay across her body, and she realized it was a thick blanket of what felt like mink fur. Her eyes flew open. She was not in her cottage. She was not in the dungeon. She was in a vast, opulent bedchamber, larger than her entire cottage. A fire crackled merrily in a carved stone fireplace across the room, casting a warm, dancing light on walls hung with rich tapestries. A plush velvet armchair sat near the hearth, and a polished mahogany table was set with a silver ewer and goblet. The single, massive window was not barred but made of leaded glass panes, offering a breathtaking, dizzying view of the city and the snow-dusted mountains beyond. This was a cage, but it was a gilded one. She sat up, the fur blanket pooling in her lap. She was wearing a simple linen nightdress, clean and soft. Her own ragged clothes were gone. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was a bird in a beautiful trap, and the falconer was the wolf who had broken her wing. The heavy wooden door opened with a soft click, and an older woman entered carrying a tray. She had kind, weary eyes, and her gray hair was tucked neatly into a white cap. A servant. She curtsied deeply when she saw Alina was awake, her movements practiced and deferential. "My lady," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "The king commanded I bring you broth and bread when you woke. He said you would need your strength." "My lady?" The title was so foreign, so absurd, that Alina almost laughed. She was a prisoner, a tool. "Where am I?" she asked, her own voice sounding small in the grand room. "The queen's chambers, my lady," the servant replied, setting the tray on the bedside table. The savory scent of chicken broth made Alina's stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. Unused for many years, of course. Since the late queen, his mother, the queen's chambers. The words were a calculated cruelty, a deliberate message. Lucen wasn't just claiming her power, he was claiming her place, rewriting the role he had denied her. He was putting her on a pedestal, but a pedestal was just a smaller, more visible cage. "Thank you," Alina said, the courtesy automatic. "You may go." The woman hesitated. "The king also commanded that you are not to be left alone." Of course. She was too valuable an asset to be left unguarded. Alina's jaw tightened. She looked at the woman, who was merely following orders, and gave a slight nod. The servant retreated to a small stool near the door, her hands folded in her lap, her presence a constant, quiet reminder of Alina's captivity. Alina forced herself to eat. The broth was warm and rich, the bread fresh and soft. She could feel the simple meal beginning to restore some of her depleted energy, chasing away the bone-deep chill that her healing had left behind. She knew Lucen was right. She would need her strength, not to serve him, but to survive him. She had just finished the last of the broth when the door opened again. This time, it was him. King Lucen filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the room. He had changed from his severe black leathers into a dark gray tunic, richly embroidered with silver thread at the collar and cuffs. It did little to soften his warrior's bearing. His gaze swept the room, noted the empty bowl on the tray, and then settled on her. "Good," he said, his voice a low rumble. He dismissed the servant with a flick of his wrist. The woman scurried out, closing the door softly behind her, leaving them in a silence that crackled with unspoken history. "I am not your pet to be kept in a fine kennel," Alina said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. A flicker of something annoyance, perhaps even surprise, crossed his face. "A kennel would be the dungeon where I found you. This is a recognition of your value, my value as a tool. Do not be naive," he snapped, taking a step closer to the bed. "You are the only thing standing between this kingdom and utter annihilation. The plague takes more of my people every day. The western farmlands are falling silent. The northern garrisons are reporting outbreaks. I do not have time for sentiment. Yes, you are a tool. You are a weapon, and I will wield you to save my people." His words were harsh, pragmatic, the words of a king. But the bond that thrummed between them told a different story. Beneath the cold logic, she could feel the frantic, possessive desperation of the Alpha. He was terrified not for himself, but for his pack, his kingdom, and that terror was driving him. "And what do I get in return for being your weapon?" she asked, pushing the fur blanket away and swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched a thick, plush rug. The floor wasn't cold here. He seemed taken aback by the question. "You get to live. You get to do so in comfort, with the protection of the crown, instead of hiding in a hovel waiting for my guards to mistake your magic for witchcraft and burn you at the stake." "I had a life," she retorted, standing to face him. She was smaller than him, had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, but she would not let him intimidate her. "You took it from me. You have no right to command my power." His eyes darkened, turning the color of a thunderhead. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I am your king, and I am your mate. I have every right." The word mate hung between them, a word he had never acknowledged except in his rejection. To hear him speak it now, to claim it as a right, was a fresh wound. "You rejected that right," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury that was 7 years old. "You stood before the entire court and declared me a mistake. You cannot reclaim a right you threw away like garbage." His face was a mask of stone, but she saw a muscle jump in his jaw. She had struck a nerve. The Alpha in him knew she was right. A rejection was sacred, final. To go back on it was to admit a catastrophic error in judgment, a weakness he could not afford to show. "What was true then is not true now," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You had no wolf. You were a weakness in the bloodline. Now you are something else, something necessary. So I am only your mate when I am useful?" The question was a blade, sharp and pointed. He had no answer for that. He simply stared at her, the conflict warring in his eyes. The king, the Alpha, the man, all three were locked in a silent, brutal battle. Finally, he took a step back, breaking the suffocating proximity. "What do you want, Alina?" he asked, the question clipped, impatient. It was a negotiation. He was acknowledging, in his own way, that he could not simply command her. He needed her cooperation. The shift in power was subtle, but it was there. She had something he needed, and he knew it. She thought of Elspeth, alone and terrified, her home destroyed. "Elspeth," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The woman who took me in, she is old. She is innocent. Your men destroyed our home. I want her brought here, to the castle. I want her given a warm room, good food, and her safety guaranteed. In writing, signed and sealed by you." Lucen's expression was unreadable. He had expected a demand for gold, for titles, for freedom. He had not expected this. a demand rooted in loyalty and love for someone else. It did not fit with the selfish, power-hoarding motives he understood. "A hedge witch," he said, a note of disdain in his voice. "A kind woman who saved a child you threw away." Alina corrected him sharply. "She is my only family. That is my price. Guarantee her safety, and I will help your people. Refuse, and you can watch your kingdom rot." For a long moment, he just looked at her. He saw not the cowering Omega he had dismissed, but a woman with a spine of steel and a heart full of fierce loyalty. It was a quality he, as an alpha, who valued loyalty above all else, could not help but respect, even as it infuriated him. "Very well," he conceded at last, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Vorlag will see to Prace. She will be brought to the castle by nightfall and given guest quarters. You have my word." "I want it in writing," she insisted. His eyes narrowed into slits. "Do not push me, Alina. Then do not give me reason to distrust you," she countered. He turned on his heel and strode to a writing desk in the corner of the room. He scribbled a few lines on a piece of parchment, his movements sharp and angry. He sealed it with the royal signet ring he wore, pressing the snarling wolf's head into the hot wax. He strode back and thrust the parchment at her. Satisfied, she took it, her fingers brushing his. A jolt, like lightning, shot up her arm. He flinched back as if burned. The bond, raw and awake, had arced between them at the simple touch. Alina clutched the parchment, her heart hammering. She nodded, unable to speak. "Good," he bit out, regaining his composure. "Then get dressed. The first ward is ready. There are 50 sick men in the lower Great Hall. They are waiting for their miracle." He turned and left without another word, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Alina was left alone, the king's decree clutched in her hand. She had won her first battle, but she knew the war was just beginning. An hour later, dressed in a simple but warm woolen dress provided for her, she was escorted by 2 guards to the lower Great Hall. The vast, vaulted chamber, normally used for feasts and celebrations, had been transformed into a makeshift hospital. Rows upon rows of cots filled the space, and on every cot lay a soldier, a servant, or a citizen from the inner city, all in various stages of the blood fever. The air was thick with the scent of sickness, sweat, and fear. Healers and their acolytes moved between the cots, their faces grim, offering sips of water or wiping fevered brows. Their efforts were futile, and they knew it. Lucen was there, standing near the entrance with General Vorlag. He was watching the scene, his face a granite mask of grim responsibility. When he saw her, he strode over, his presence immediately silencing the low murmurs in the hall. All eyes turned to her. "Start there," he commanded, pointing to the nearest cot where a young soldier was shivering violently, his teeth chattering. Alina walked past him without a word and knelt by the soldier's side. She could feel the stares of everyone in the hall on her back, skeptical, hopeful, fearful. She ignored them all and placed her hands on the young man's forehead. She closed her eyes and let her power flow. The light bloomed, soft and ethereal in the grim hall. A collective gasp rippled through the room. She felt the sickness rush into her, a vile, icy tide. She cleansed it, pushed her own life force into the void it left behind, and felt the familiar, draining exhaustion begin to set in. When the light faded, the soldier was sleeping peacefully, his fever broken. Without pausing, she moved to the next cot, and the next, and the next. She worked her way down the row, a silent, focused vessel of impossible power. With each healing, she grew paler, a tremor starting in her hands. The hall, once filled with the sounds of suffering, grew quiet, replaced by hushed whispers of awe and disbelief. Lucen watched, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He saw her power, saw it working, saw it saving his men one by one. But he also saw the cost. He saw the color draining from her face, the way she swayed slightly after the 10th healing, the dark circles that were beginning to form under her eyes. The tool was effective, but it was also fragile. And the sight of her, deliberately breaking herself to fulfill his command, stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a feeling he refused to name. After she had healed the 15th man, she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a cot. Her vision swam with black spots. "Enough!" A voice cut through her haze, sharp and commanding. She looked up, to see Lucen standing over her. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed with an intensity that had nothing to do with royal duty. Before she could protest that there were still more, he reached down, his hand closing around her arm, His grip was firm, unyielding. The touch was electric, sending another jolt through the bond between them, but this time it was different. It wasn't a claim or a threat. It was an anchor. I said, "Enough," he repeated, his voice lower now, a rough growl that was meant only for her. "You are done for today." Lucen's grip on her arm was not brutal, but it was absolute. It was the grip of a man used to taking what he wanted, of a king used to his will being law. He pulled her away from the cots, away from the sea of sickness and the wide, staring eyes of his men. Alina stumbled, her legs feeling like water, her head spinning from the exertion. She was acutely aware of the point of contact between them, the heat of his skin through the thin wool of her sleeve, the sheer strength in his fingers. The bond, that traitorous, invisible thread, flared to life, sending a dizzying rush of his own emotions through her. Grim determination, a flicker of raw frustration, and underneath it all, a deep, resonant hum of possessiveness that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He didn't slow his pace. He towed her from the great hall, his long strides forcing her into a near run to keep up. They moved through the castle corridors, a king and his captive healer, a storm of power and silence. Servants and guards flattened themselves against the walls, their heads bowed, their eyes averted. No one dared to meet the king's gaze, when his face was set like granite. When they reached the ornate door to the queen's chambers, he didn't release her. He pushed the door open and propelled her inside before finally letting go. She staggered forward, catching herself on the high back of the velvet armchair by the fire. She stood there, her back to him, breathing heavily, trying to quell the trembling in her limbs. "That was reckless," he said, his voice a low growl from the doorway. It vibrated through the floorboards. "You were draining yourself to the point of collapse. What good are you to my kingdom dead?" The cold, pragmatic words were like a douse of icy water, extinguishing the confusing warmth that had sparked at his touch. Of course, his concern was for his asset, not for her. She turned to face him, her chin high despite the exhaustion that was pulling at her from the inside out. They were dying. Is it not a king's duty to save his people at any cost? She threw his own ruthless philosophy back at him. His eyes flashed, a flicker of lightning in a stormy sky. "The cost will not be you. Not yet." He took a step into the room, his presence immediately shrinking the grand space. "You will heal no more than 10 a day. That is my command. You will rest, you will eat, and you will conserve your strength. Am I understood? And if I refuse?" She challenged, though the words were breathless. He smiled, but it was a chilling, predatory expression that held no humor. "Then I will have you chained to that bed and brought to the sick one by one. You will do my will, Alina. The only choice you have is the manner in which you do it." The threat was vile, absolute. It stripped away any illusion of control she might have felt. She was his, body and soul. Until this plague was over, or until she burned out. She gave a single, sharp nod, the fight draining out of her. She was too tired for this. "Good," he said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly, as if sensing he had pushed her to her limit. "Food will be brought to you, and your family is being settled in the East Wing." He turned and left, closing the door with a quiet final click. Elspeth. The thought of the old woman gave her a surge of strength. He had kept his word. For the first time, a complicated emotion warred with her fear and resentment. He was a tyrant, a monster who had broken her heart, but he was a tyrant who kept his promises. True to his word, the same kind-eyed servant from the morning returned with a tray laden with roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and a pitcher of spiced wine. Alina ate mechanically, the rich food tasting like ash in her mouth. As she ate, the door opened again. This time it was Elspeth, her face pale and pinched with worry, flanked by 2 impassive guards who stopped at the threshold. "Elspeth!" Alina cried, dropping her fork. She ran across the room and threw her arms around the old woman. Elspeth felt so small and frail in the vastness of the castle, but her embrace was as strong and steady as an old oak tree. "Oh, my child," Elspeth murmured, her hand stroking Alina's hair. They told me what you did, what he is making you do." She pulled back, her sharp eyes scanning Alina's face, taking in the exhaustion, and the new, haunted look in her eyes. "He is using you up, little bird, burning you like a candle from both ends." "He kept his word," Alina whispered. "He brought you here. You're safe." "Safe?" Elspeth gave a short, bitter laugh, gesturing at the gilded cage around them. "We are prisoners, Alina. Do not mistake fine linens and warm meals for freedom. The wolf has you in his jaws, and he will not let go. They sat by the fire, and Alina told her everything, the confrontation in the throne room, the healing of the king's guard, the bargain for Elspeth's safety, and the grim procession of 6 soldiers in the great hall. Elspeth listened, her expression growing darker with each word. "The bond between you," she said when Alina had finished. "It is not severed. It is only damaged. I can feel the echo of it in this room. His rejection broke the surface, but the roots run too deep. Your proximity to him is waking it up. I feel it," Alina admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. "It hurts. It feels like being torn in two. That is his conflict you are feeling. Child, the king who rejected you and the alpha who wants to claim you are at war inside him, and you are the battlefield." Elspeth's gaze was grave. "Be careful, Alina. A cornered wolf is dangerous, but a wolf at war with itself is a cataclysm." Later that evening, Elspeth was escorted to her own chambers, leaving Alina once again alone with her thoughts and the crackling fire. She drifted into a restless sleep in the velvet armchair, too agitated to climb into the massive, empty bed. Her dreams were a chaotic swirl of images: the scorn in Lucin's eyes 7 years ago, the dying faces of the soldiers, the cold weight of the manacles on her wrists. She saw her wolf, a small, silver-white creature, whimpering in a cage of black obsidian, reaching for a great, shadowy wolf that turned its back and walked away. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was dark, the fire burned down to glowing embers, but she was not alone. A figure stood by the window, a tall silhouette against the moonlit glass. Lucin. He hadn't made a sound entering. He moved with a predator's grace that was unnerving. He was just watching her, his face lost in shadow. "A nightmare?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that was strangely devoid of its usual harshness. Alina's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't speak. She simply nodded, pulling the fur blanket she'd dragged from the bed tighter around her shoulders. He moved away from the window, and the faint moonlight caught the angles of his face. He looked weary, the iron mask of the king replaced by something more human, more troubled. He walked to the fireplace and used a poker to stir the embers, coaxing a few weak flames back to life. "The healers report that all 15 men you treated today will make a full recovery," he said, his back still to her. "They call it a divine intervention. My council is calling for you to be named a saint of the realm." He said the word saint with a tone of deep, cynical irony. "I am not a saint," she whispered to the quiet room. "No," he agreed, turning to face her. The new flames cast dancing shadows across his face, making his expression hard to read. "You are something far more dangerous. You are real." He walked towards her, stopping just before the armchair. He looked down at her, his gaze intense. "I saw you in my mind when you healed them," he said, the admission sounding as if it were being torn from him. "A flash of light, a feeling of emptiness after. The bond. It carried the echo of what you were doing." Alina stared at him, stunned. He had felt it. He had felt a piece of her sacrifice. "Why did you reject me, Lucin?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. A raw, vulnerable plea from a wound that had never closed. His face hardened, the mask snapping back into place. "I told you. You were a flaw." "No." She shook her head, a sudden, fierce certainty rising in her. That was the excuse. That was the king's reason. What was the man's? He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the hiss and crackle of the fire. She thought he would turn and leave, that she had pushed too far. Instead, he raised a hand and touched the faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. "This was a gift from my father," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I was 16. My fated mate had just been identified a daughter from a southern pack, chosen to forge an alliance. I was young. I believed the songs, the tales of the moon-blessed bond. I spoke of her with a poet's foolishness in my father's presence." He paused, his thumb tracing the line of the scar, his eyes looking at something far away, a memory replaying itself. "My father, King Theron, was not a sentimental man. He believed emotion was a sickness. He said the bond was a weakness, a leash that an enemy could pull. He told me my mother's love had nearly cost him his throne during the border wars, that his enemies had used her to manipulate him." Lucin's gaze dropped from the past and met hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw a flicker of the 16-year-old boy who had received a brutal lesson. "To prove his point," Lucin continued, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion, "he took his dagger and gave me this scar. He told me every time I looked at my reflection, I was to remember that a king cannot afford the luxury of a heart. And then he sent a message to the southern pack that the alliance was off, the mating voided. I never even met her. He taught me that day that to love your mate is to give your enemy a blade to press to your throat. Alina stared at him, speechless. The truth of it, the cold, calculated cruelty, was breathtaking. He hadn't just been taught that love was a weakness. It had been carved into his face. His rejection of her hadn't been a simple act of political pragmatism. It was the culmination of a lifetime of brutal indoctrination. He had rejected her not because she was flawed, but because he was terrified of the connection she represented. When you were presented, he went on, his voice still low, and the bond flared between us. All I could see was my father's dagger. And when I learned you had no wolf, it was a gift from the gods, a justifiable reason, a flaw I could point to make the rejection clean, logical, king's business. It had nothing to do with my heart. He looked down at her, curled in the chair, and a strange, almost pained expression crossed his face. But you are not a weakness, are you, Alina? You are a power I never could have imagined. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed her cheek. His touch was not a brand of ownership this time. It was tentative, questioning. His calloused thumb stroked the soft skin beneath her eye, and the jolt that went through her was one of pure, aching connection. Your power may save my people, he murmured, his voice a rough whisper. But I am beginning to think it is you who will destroy me. And then he was gone, turning and striding from the room as silently as he had entered, leaving her trembling in the firelight, the ghost of his touch burning on her skin, and the weight of his confession settling over her like a shroud. The confession hung in the air long after Lucen had gone, a ghost that settled into the quiet corners of the opulent room. Alina did not go back to sleep. She sat by the dying fire, replaying his words, his touch, the raw, unguarded pain she had seen in his eyes. It didn't excuse the cruelty of his rejection, but it reframed it, turning it from a simple act of arrogance into a desperate act of self-preservation. He had been a boy who had his heart carved out of him by his own father, and he had grown into a king who saw love as the executioner's axe. The revelation changed nothing, and yet it changed everything. Her anger, a clean, sharp blade she had honed for 7 years, now felt blunted, complicated by a reluctant sliver of understanding, a dangerous seed of pity. He was a monster, but he was a monster who had been made, not born. The days that followed fell into a grim, exhausting routine. Each morning, she was escorted to the lower Great Hall. The number of sick had not diminished. As she healed 10, 20 more would be brought in from the city and the outlying villages. Lucen's decree was absolute. She healed 10, and no more. Guards were posted to enforce the limit, and at the first sign of her faltering, Lucen himself would appear, his presence a thundercloud, and pull her away. He never touched her again. He kept his distance, a silent, brooding sentinel watching her work. But the bond between them was a living thing now, a conduit. She felt his constant, heavy awareness of her, a focused intensity that was almost a physical touch. When her energy flagged, she would feel a strange, phantom surge of strength, a whisper of his own immense alpha power bleeding across the bond, as if he were instinctively trying to reinforce her. And in his presence, her own silent, crippled wolf would stir, not with fear anymore, but with a deep, mournful yearning that was a constant ache beneath her ribs. The court, meanwhile, buzzed with whispers. She was the veiled saint, the king's miracle, the wolfless wonder. They stared at her with a mixture of awe, fear, and suspicion. To them, she was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order. Omegas were meant to be soft, nurturing, the heart of the pack. They were not supposed to wield a power that could command life and death, a power that had captured the unwavering attention of their fearsome king. One evening, after a particularly grueling session where one of the patients had been a small child, leaving Alina shaken and emotionally drained, Elspeth came to her chambers. The old woman's face was etched with a new kind of worry. "There is talk in the halls," she said, her voice low, as she helped Alina sip a restorative herbal tea. "From the servants, the lower court members. They are afraid of you, child." "They should be grateful," Alina said, her voice weary. "I am saving their lives." "You are upsetting the balance," Elspeth corrected gently. "An Omega with more power than an Alpha. A rejected mate who now holds the king's undivided attention. You are a threat to those who have built their power on the old ways." She leaned closer, especially Lord Vorlag, Alina frowned. Vorlag? He is the king's most loyal man. He is loyal to the king. He understands the cold, ruthless alpha who values strength above all. He does not understand this new king, the one who watches you with an obsession that has nothing to do with saving the kingdom. Vorlag sees you as a witch who has enchanted his master. He believes you are a weakness, the very thing the king has spent his life avoiding. The warning chilled Alina to the bone. She had seen the way Vorlag looked at her, his eyes cold and hard as chips of flint. He saw her not as a savior, but as a contamination in the purity of his king's power. Her fears were confirmed 2 days later. She was walking in the walled garden, a rare hour of freedom granted to her, though always under the watchful eye of 2 guards when Vorlag approached. "My lady Alina," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He inclined his head in a bow so shallow it was more of an insult than a sign of respect. The guards immediately tensed, stepping closer to her. "General," she replied, her voice steady. "The king sings your praises," Vorlag said, his small eyes glinting. "As does the entire castle. A saint walks among us." The words were laced with venom. "It is remarkable. A wolfless Omega, barren and weak, suddenly develops the power of a goddess the moment the kingdom is on its knees. A convenient miracle, is it not? The gods work in ways we do not understand," Alina answered coolly, quoting a common platitude. Vorlag's lip curled. "I do not believe in gods. I believe in power, and power always has a source, and a price." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so the guards couldn't hear. "The king has forgotten his father's most important lesson. He allows his gaze to linger on you. He shows concern. This is not the king who built this strong, merciless kingdom. You are making him weak." "The king's strength seems perfectly intact to me," Alina countered, refusing to be intimidated. "For now," Vorlag hissed, his facade of courtesy dropping entirely. "But a sickness of the heart is more insidious than any plague. Know this, witch. I have served the Ardar line my entire life. I will not stand by and watch it be brought to ruin by a manipulative outcast. You have your uses for now. But once this plague is done, your miracle will end." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving a palpable trail of menace in his wake. The threat was clear. He was waiting for her usefulness to expire. That night, the weight of it all, the relentless drain of the healings, the court's fear, Vorlag's open hostility, and the suffocating emotional turmoil of her connection to Lucen became too much. After the servant brought her evening meal, Alina pushed it away, untouched. She walked to the large, ornate window and pushed it open, letting the cold night air wash over her. Below, the castle was quiet, the city a scattering of distant lights. The moon was nearly full, a perfect silver disk, hanging in an inky sky. It called to the wolf in her, the pathetic creature she so often ignored. Tonight, its yearning was a physical pain, a desperate cry for something it had never had, for a freedom it would never know. A wave of utter despair washed over her. She was a prisoner, a tool, a target. And the man who held the key to her cage was the source of her deepest pain and her most confusing, unwanted hope. Tears she had refused to shed for 7 years finally welled in her eyes. Hot and bitter, they traced cold paths down her cheeks as a single, silent sob escaped her. A floorboard creaked behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was Lucen. His presence was a magnetic force, pulling at every nerve in her body. "Close the window, Alina. You'll catch a chill." His voice was quiet, rough with an emotion she couldn't place. She didn't move, didn't turn. She couldn't let him see her tears. "I needed some air." She heard him move closer, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. He stopped just behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the cold night air on her face. "Vorlag spoke to you today," he stated. "It wasn't a question. I was told." She flinched, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "He is very protective of you. He is a hammer that sees every problem as a nail," Lucen murmured, his voice closer now, just beside her ear. "He fears what he cannot understand. And he cannot understand you." He paused. "Neither can I." The raw honesty in his voice made her turn. He was standing so close, his expression shadowed and intense. Her breath hitched. The tears she had tried to hide were still glistening on her cheeks in the moonlight, his eyes fixed on them, and his face, for a moment, was stripped of all its royal harshness, leaving only a raw, aching vulnerability. Instinct, pure and unthinking, took over. He raised his hand. his thumb coming up to gently brush a tear from her cheek. The touch was electric, 1,000 times more potent than before. It wasn't a question or a brand. It was a surrender. The king, the alpha, the broken man, all of him was in that single, gentle caress. The bond between them ignited. It was no longer a dull ache or a sharp sting, but a roaring inferno of shared emotion. Her despair, his confusion, her loneliness, his isolation, and a deep, soul-shattering longing that belonged to them both. Alina's defenses, so carefully constructed over 7 long years, crumbled to dust. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. His scent, pine and winter and steel, was an anchor in a swirling sea. Lucen's own control snapped. Seeing her cry, feeling the depth of her sorrow through the bond, shattered the final wall around his long-guarded heart. "My father was wrong," a voice screamed in his head. "This is not weakness. This is strength. This is everything." He lowered his head, his forehead coming to rest against hers. His other hand came up to cup her face, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle as they held her. "Alina," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. It was too much. The proximity, the emotional torrent, the unspoken confession in his touch. Her own wolf, silent for a lifetime, surged forward with a strength she had never known, howling for its mate. For the first time, she felt a real, tangible power stirring in her limbs, a tingling heat that had nothing to do with her healing gift. It was the shift. The moon, her mate, the raw emotion of the moment. It was all culminating into the one thing she had always been denied. A low growl rumbled in Lucen's chest as he felt it, a primal, possessive sound of pure triumph. He could feel her wolf, his wolf's chosen, finally answering the call. But at that same moment, a sharp, searing pain exploded in his chest. His eyes flew open, wide with shock and agony. He gasped, his hands dropping from her face as he staggered back, clutching at his heart. "Lucen?" Alina cried out, her own transformation stalling as she saw the look on his face. He looked down. A dark, wet stain was spreading, rapidly across the front of his gray tunic, blossoming from the center of his chest. He looked up at her, his storm-gray eyes clouded with confusion, and a pain so immense it stole her breath. He tried to speak, but only a choked, gurgling sound came out. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and the great, powerful Alpha King collapsed onto the floor of the Queen's chambers, a thin trail of blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Alina stared, frozen in horror for one heartbeat, and then she saw it. Protruding from the silver goblet on the table, the one he must have drunk from upon entering her room, was a single, needle-thin sliver of dark wood, nightshade root, a poison known to be undetectable, swift, and lethal to werewolves, attacking the heart and shutting it down within minutes. Vorlag's threat echoed in her mind. Your miracle will end. He hadn't meant her. He had meant the king she was supposedly weakening. He had poisoned the king to save the kingdom from the king's own heart. For a frozen second, the world was silent, reduced to the horrifying tableau on the floor. Lucen, the indomitable king, felled not by a blade in battle but by a coward's poison in the sanctity of her chambers. The scent of spilled blood and nightshade root, acrid and unnaturally sweet, filled the air. Then, the paralysis broke. A raw, primal scream tore from Alina's throat, a sound ripped from the deepest part of her soul where her wolf had just begun to stir. It was not a scream of fear. It was a roar of denial, of rage. She threw herself to his side, her hands hovering over the dark stain on his chest. Panic was a useless, shrieking thing in her mind. Her healing gift was for sickness, for the slow corruption of the plague. It was a gentle, persuasive power, a coaxing of life back into weary cells. This was different. This was a violent, chemical invasion. The poison was an assassin, and it was tearing his heart apart from the inside. "No," a voice whispered. Within her, a voice she had never heard before, yet knew as her own. It was her wolf, finally, fully awake, roused not by the moon or by a mate's gentle call, but by the imminent threat of his death. Not him, not ours. Her power surged, but it was different now. It was no longer a soft, pearlescent glow. It was a blaze of pure, silver-white fire, erupting from her palms with a searing heat. She slammed her hands onto his chest, right over his heart. She didn't try to take the poison into herself. She knew it would destroy her in an instant. Instead, she pushed. She poured her very essence, her life force, her newly awakened wolf spirit, into him. It was a desperate, brutal war, waged in the landscape of his veins. The poison fought back, a cold, venomous entity. She felt its resistance, a slick, oily darkness that tried to consume her light. Black veins spiderwebbed across Lucen's skin under her hands. His body convulsed, a low, agonized sound rattling in his throat. Outside, the door. Her scream had raised the alarm. Heavy boots thundered down the corridor. "The king! What's happened to the king?" The door burst open. The 2 guards from the garden stood there, their swords half drawn, their faces masks of horror. Behind them was Vorlag. His expression was a carefully constructed facade of shock, but his eyes, for a fraction of a second, flickered with triumphant satisfaction as he looked at the dying king and the woman kneeling over him. "Seize her!" Vorlag bellowed, his voice ringing with false authority. "The witch has killed him. She has poisoned the king." The guards hesitated, their eyes wide as they saw the incandescent light pouring from Alina's hands. They had seen this light before, in the Great Hall. It was the light of a saint, not an assassin. "It was not her!" a voice cried from the hallway. Elspeth pushed her way through a throng of gathering servants, her face a blaze of fury. "I saw him. Vorlag." He switched the king's clock, goblet with one from his own cloak as he entered. Vorlag's face contorted with rage. "Lies! The senile ramblings of a hedge witch. Arrest them both!" But his order was met with defiance. A new sound joined the chaos, the clang of steel on steel. Kaelin, the first guard Alina had saved in the throne room, had appeared with a half-dozen other soldiers, all of them bearing the pallor of recent recovery. They formed a protective wall in the doorway, their swords raised not against Alina, but against the general. "We stand with the healer," Kaelin declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "We owe her our lives. We will not let you touch her." Vorlag stared at the line of loyal men, his plan unraveling. His face turned a mottled red. "Traitors! You will all hang for this." Alina was barely aware of the standoff. Her entire world had narrowed to the man beneath her hands. He was fading. She could feel his life force, the great, powerful flame of the Alpha King, sputtering and dying. The poison had reached his heart. "It's not enough," her wolf cried within her. "He is too far gone." She knew what she had to do. There was only one way. A bond, once broken, could be reforged in the most extreme of moments. She leaned down, her hair tenting around them, shutting out the world. Her lips found the pulse point on his throat, right over the carotid artery, the place where a mating mark was meant to be. With a cry that was part sob, part snarl, she bit down. It was not a lover's mark. It was an anchor, a desperate claim. Her canines, sharp and newly formed, pierced his skin. Her own blood mingled with his. Through the wound, she poured everything she was, her light, her life, her soul directly into his bloodstream. A final, cataclysmic gambit to burn the poison from his body. The world exploded in a silent, blinding flash of silver light. The bond between them, damaged and frayed for so long, snapped into place, whole and perfect and absolute. A wave of power erupted from them, throwing everyone in the doorway back. Vorlag was sent crashing into the far wall of the corridor. In the ensuing silence, Lucen's body arched off the floor. He took a single, shuddering, life-affirming gasp. The black veins receded. The color began to flood back into his face. His eyes, which had been dull and lifeless, fluttered and opened. They were no longer the color of a storm, but of a clear sky after the rain has passed. They focused on her, and in their depths, she saw not a king or an alpha, but a man seeing his salvation, his other half, for the very first time. His hand came up, no longer trembling, and cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her gently from his neck. The small wounds were already closing, leaving behind a faint, glowing mark on his skin, her claim. "Alina," he whispered, his voice rough, reborn. 3 moons later, the snows had melted from the mountains, and the kingdom of the northern Fang was breathing again. The plague, which had seemed an insurmountable beast, had broken with the coming of spring, with the king at her side, lending her his strength through their now unbreakable bond. Alina had moved through the city, her healing no longer a desperate, draining act, but a steady, confident flow of life. She had healed the last of the sick a month ago. The pyres were cold, and the sound of children's laughter had returned to the streets. Alina stood on the balcony of the queen's chambers, which were now truly her own. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the gardens below. She was no longer the veiled saint or the wolfless wonder. She was Alina Ardar, the healer queen. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. She leaned back into Lucen's embrace, her head fitting perfectly into the curve of his neck. He no longer smelled only of pine and steel, but of home. His scent was her comfort, her anchor. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured into her hair, his deep voice a soothing rumble against her back. "Vorlag," she admitted quietly. After Lucen had recovered, his justice had been swift and absolute. He had not executed his former general. He had done something far more fitting. He'd stripped Vorlag of his titles and his sword, and exiled him to the blighted lands to the north, a barren, unforgiving wilderness from which no one ever returned. He who fears weakness so much, Lucen had decreed before the entire court, shall now live with nothing but his own. He made his choice, Lucen said, his arms tightening around her. He chose fear. We choose this. He turned her in his arms, his gaze soft in the moonlight. The scar on his brow was just a faint silver line now, a memory of a lesson he had finally unlearned. On his neck, her mating mark was a swirl of delicate silvery tissue, a beautiful scar he wore with more pride than his crown. "My father was a fool," he said, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. It was a gesture that was now as familiar as breathing. "He taught me that the bond was a leash. He was wrong. It is a mirror. It shows you who you are and who you have the strength to become." Alina smiled, her heart full. "And who are you, Lucen?" "I am the man who is lucky enough to be your mate," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. He leaned down and kissed her. A slow, deep kiss filled with the quiet promises of a shared lifetime. When they broke apart, they looked out over their sleeping kingdom. The full moon, the same moon that had witnessed her despair, now seemed to bless them, bathing the world in a gentle, silver light. Her wolf, strong and serene within her, stretched contentedly. It was no great warrior wolf, no hulking beast. It was a graceful, silver-white healer, its spirit intertwined with her own. Later tonight, they would run together, she and Lucen, their two wolves racing through the moon-drenched forest, not as a king and his consort, but as two halves of a single soul, finally made whole. Lucen took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The broken pieces of their past had been reforged in fire and sacrifice, creating something stronger, more beautiful than what had come before. The king who had once called her a mistake had found his entire world in her. The Omega who had once been an outcast had become the heart of her kingdom. Their story had not been a fairy tale, but it was real, and its ending was not an ending at all, but a beginning.